Hello and welcome to the first in a series of mini workshops that I put together that are focused on the importance of mindset. And for those of you who are listening and don't know me, I'm a sports psychology specialist in the kinesiology department. I've been a professor for 16 years, but I'm lucky to have spent the last 10 years at Oxy. And I imagine I'm not alone in saying that the last semester was the most challenging one that I have ever experienced. And even as someone who has an advanced degree in sports psychology, I did my dissertation on stress management, I still definitely struggled. And so now that I've taken some time to reflect on what felt especially difficult for me and what I learned during that process, so that I could be better prepared for this upcoming year, recognizing that we still will be facing some unusual circumstances. And so my purpose with these mini workshops is just to briefly share some background information, offer some strategies, and encourage you to reflect on your experience in a similar way that I have, so that you can feel more resilient going into this next academic year. One of the biggest factors that I have found really tends to cause discomfort or feelings of negative stress is this perception that we lack control over a situation. And certainly in the spring, I can think of countless factors that we could not control. Certainly the unwelcome arrival of this virus and then everything that it came with. For many people, sports seasons suddenly disappeared. You had to move back home, which for many people caused a very drastic shift in their social life. Places that we were used to frequenting were shut down. You all had to become remote learners in a matter of days. And what we tend to do here with these demands is that we automatically feel as though we have to respond to them in a particular way. And very often we experience a negative response. And that can further exacerbate this feeling of powerlessness and feeling like we don't have control over a situation. It's almost as though we are acting as though we're at the mercy of our demands. And so a big part of my work is trying to help people shift their focus away from these things, these demands that are not in their control. And so the controllable part here of this relationship between the demand and the response is the idea of the perception. And so trying to shift our energy, we spend a lot of energy and time focusing on the demands in our life, many times which are very much out of our control. And so instead of spending all that time and energy on the demands, trying to think more about our perception of those demands, and that we don't necessarily have to automatically have a negative response, right? So that perhaps if we can shift our perception a bit, that can help us to then control the response a bit better, right? Trying to regain some of that control. And so the demands, as we experienced in the spring, many of them were inevitable. We had no control over them. But the negative effects they caused didn't necessarily have to be as connected to the demand. We had a little bit more control over that than oftentimes we realize. It's really trying to shift this energy to controlling your perception instead of trying to change the demand, right? The amount of time that, and I'm sure many of us are still thinking this way, gosh, I just wish this virus would go away. I wish things could get back to normal. Very rational and real types of feelings, I think. But again, trying to not necessarily spend all our time and energy thinking about these inevitable demands. A part of what can help us be able to use our perception to have a more positive or protective response to our demands is to recognize our resources. And so you'll see here, looking at almost like a figure that represents a scale, right? And so oftentimes if we are way too focused on our demands, that makes it much easier to then lead to a negative response to that stress. And instead, then if you could utilize your perception to try and shift that scale so that it's not that the demands are outweighing the resources, but viewing it as the other way around. And so thinking about, and our resources are going to be very different depending on the person. And so what works for you may not work for one of your peers, right? And so in thinking about resources could just be simply getting outdoors, kind of getting some fresh air. You might have found that a good resource for you is connecting with a friend, and it may not have been in the ideal scenario. You would have much rather gone out to eat with this person, right? Or getting a cup of coffee or working out with them and seeing them in person, but recognizing that that was not necessarily an option in the spring. But realizing is, even if you can get a phone call or whatever it might be with a friend, that worked for you. Meditation certainly is really a useful resource for some people. Journaling or finding some kind of non-judgmental outlet for your emotions and thoughts can be a very useful resource. I know for me, something that I noticed was that I had to really limit social media because I found it was so inundated with information and negativity and the news as well, just kind of shutting off the news. And so that was, for me, as I was reflecting in terms of a resource that I really had to utilize more than I had in other situations. At the end of the 4 workshops that I have put together, I will always offer up some type of reflection activity so that you can really try and personalize the information and make the most out of the strategies. And so here with this activity, the first step is really just thinking about for you what your specific demands or sources of stress were in this past spring semester, right? So really trying to lay all of those things out right on a piece of paper and kind of taking a look at those. And then the next step is thinking about how you responded to these demands. And just like our resources are going to be very individualized, our responses to stress are also very individual in nature. And so for you, you might have found that you tended to go to a very negative place with your thoughts, or you had a hard time focusing as a response to stress. You may have had very emotional reactions, right? Obviously, our emotions can vary on a very wide scale there. You may have noticed physically, maybe having a lot of muscle tension could have been a response to stress. And then certainly there are very common behavioral responses as well. And so you can look at shift in sleeping habits or eating habits. You may have noticed that you tended to withdraw from people, kind of just lock yourself up in your room for long periods of time. And you also may realize that your response could have really depended on that particular source of stress. And so that is also really useful in terms of the awareness piece of this reflection. The third part is considering whether there might have been some conditions that exacerbated your responses to these demands. I heard from many of my students that when they were at home, suddenly their sleep schedule was very different than when it was when they were living back on campus or near campus. And so what they felt like was a very ineffective sleep schedule and oftentimes left them feeling fatigued or unproductive. And so that may have been something that you experienced as well. Hunger is a very common condition that can exacerbate responses or make demands feel even more heavy, more negative than they are. Lack of physical activity could have been something that played a role into a more negative response for you. Having social isolation, right? And we certainly all had that to a certain degree, I would say, in the spring, but you may have had certain days or certain times where you felt like you had more severe responses because you were not interacting with people at all, or not as much as you would like. And then certainly screen time can play into this as well. And then from there, the really important part of this is thinking about how might you have been able to alter your perception. You can look at this in a couple different ways. So part of this is considering looking back at these sources of stress or demands and trying to think about, well, were they as negative as perhaps you thought? And thinking now, having this ability to think in hindsight and say, gosh, maybe did I make too much of a particular source of stress? It wasn't actually that bad, right? And so sometimes that's helpful with perception. Demands, though, I recognize also may very well have been unpleasant. And so it's not always realistic to perceive a demand as something that was more positive than you thought, or you may have even looked back on it and say it was enjoyable, right? So that certainly is the case. So I had a couple of students actually who confided in me that during this time when they were home, there was a sudden passing of a family member, not due to COVID necessarily, but the sudden passing and then being unable to grieve with their family and friends in the way that they wanted to because of the physical distancing that was required. And so that's something where it's going to be very difficult to look at that demand and say, oh, that wasn't bad, or that wasn't unpleasant. Absolutely, that is something that it's very rational to label as being negative, right? But could we then think about spending more energy trying to utilize or develop resources that you had access to, rather than spending so much time just thinking about the negativity or wishing that the demand would go away? And so here, thinking about, again, this power of perception, could you have utilized some additional resources, right? Or perhaps as well, maybe you can think about resources that you did use and something that worked really effectively. And so that, being aware of that can be particularly useful as well. And certainly I think in terms of utilizing resources, I think it's perfectly acceptable to view other people as a resource. It's a very common thing that we use to try and help us deal with stress, right? But I also want to encourage you to really see yourself as a resource. And certainly I think I again had some students that talked about wishing a particular professor would change an assignment or change a due date or certain things. Again, these somewhat uncontrollable demands that were very, very present. But really trying to shift then to, okay, well, how can I actually be my own resource in this situation? And perhaps thinking about how you can take control of scheduling your day differently, right? And you may very well have certain things, whether it's work or taking care of family members, whatever it might be, that were set in your schedule, and that's perfectly fine. But really trying to think about, are there certain times when you are most productive during the day? Are you able to control your work schedule perhaps, right? Where you are going to your job at a time when you're not productive anyways, and then you're spending your productive times of the day on your work assignments, right? Or can you limit social media time on certain days when you know you have a particular assignment that's due, right? And so really, I think trying to not just depend on outside resources, but really seeing yourself as a resource as well will certainly help with this feeling of control in a very stressful time. So keeping in mind that the negative stress response tends to occur when we believe that our demands outweigh our resources and our coping abilities. And so this activity is a good first step to trying to take control, which hopefully will leave you feeling a greater sense of calm and resilience going into whatever this next semester will bring for us.